Hello everyone and welcome back to this another lecture on Introduction to Literary Theory. So far we have studied the contributions of Plato and his specific contributions to the theory of mimesis, to the theory of forms and ideas, his thoughts on writing, his thoughts on poets and poetry, and we went about discussing Aristotle and his contributions again to the theory of mimesis and his very important contribution in terms of the whole idea of tragedy. We specifically looked at the definition of tragedy and then went about discussing each part that we saw in that definitions. And in today's lecture, we will be looking at the contributions of Philip Sidney. So these are very significant contributions that are made by Philip Sidney to the theory, especially establishing the significance of poetry over history, philosophy, and many other subjects. So it was a challenging phase for literature to be very specific poetry, and Sidney stands firm and establishes the prominence of poetry. So, what was the background to which Philip Sidney actually responds and writes this particular piece that we are going to discuss today? So, this is something that happens, and as a result, as a response to this, Philip Sidney writes the piece that we are going to study today. In 1579, a Puritan minister named Stephen Gosson, he published an attack on theatres, and this was the title, The School of Abuse. So Stephen Gosson writes a piece titled The School of Abuse, attacking the theatres. Now he does not stop there. Now this is something very interesting, and this is how he goes about dedicating. The piece, The School of Abuse, was dedicated to the right noble gentleman, Master Philip Sidney Esquire. Now, this is something very interesting to know, that Stephen Gosson and Philip Sidney were not friends. They were not buddies. They were not relatives. And yet, Stephen Gosson writes that piece, The School of Abuse, attacking theatre, and then dedicates it to Philip Sidney. So this background is very important for us to know. So what happens is Stephen Gosson's all this, the kind of arguments that Gosson uses in The School of Abuse, he draws most of those arguments from Plato's objection to poetry. So therefore it is just kind of a response or reply to Republic. So let's see what exactly we will see in The School of Abuse, the arguments that Stephen Gosson puts forth, and then the responses of Philip Sidney. Now, as a response to The School of Abuse by Stephen Gosson, Philip Sidney writes this particular piece, and it is titled An Apology for Poetry, one name, or Defense of Poetry. Both the names are the same. Some books use it as an apology for poetry, and some others use it as defense of poetry, and both are equally correct. Now, what are the things that we would see basically in this piece? There are three major points. The first one, or I would say the whole piece, which runs into about 25 to 30 pages, focuses on these three issues, and they are very systematically divided in that piece. First one, he defends the dignity of poetry, demonstrating its superiority to history and philosophy, and that's the first thing that he does. He says poetry is far more superior to history and philosophy, and then he gives his own reasons as to why it is superior and why the other two subjects are inferior to poetry. The second one, the second thing that he focuses in his piece of writing is deals with the specific objections raised against poetry by Stephen Gosson. So Stephen Gosson has raised certain issues with regard to poetry, and he very specifically answers them, all of them. So that's the second part of his essay. And the third part is he examines the current status of literature. So what was the current status of literature then and not today? So 1590s or 80s, during those years. So what was the status of literature today then? So these are the clear-cut three things, that elements that you would find in the piece written by Philip Sidney, and the title is The Defense of Poetry, or An Apology of Poetry. So Stephen Gosson's charges, this is the second part of these are the charges laid down by Stephen Gosson in his piece The School of Abuse, and eventually Sidney will answer or provide arguments or counter arguments for this all of this charges. The first one is poetry is a waste of time. So he says there is no Stephen Gosson says there is no virtue in writing poetry, there is no virtue in reading poetry. So it's absolutely waste of time. There is nothing good that comes out of poetry. So therefore no man in his senses would actually write or read poetry. So this also comes most of these arguments come from the thoughts of Plato. That's the first one. He says poetry can neither do any good to anyone, nor it can bring about any change in anybody. So therefore it is complete waste of time. The second argument is poetry is the mother of lies. So a poet presents things which are actually not right. That is first part. The second one also, as Plato has already said, a poet evokes emotions. He does not fall back on his reason, and therefore anything that is evoked by emotions tends to lean towards pleasure, and pleasure is not good. That's the argument that Plato follows, and therefore all that a poet presents which is evoked from emotion can never be true. It is always going to be lies, or at least it's not going to be very pleasant. So when do you cannot come across truth by being emotional. You got to be reasonable, you got to be rational if you want to come across truth. So therefore, but poetry does not believe in that. It does not rationalize the things. So that's the second accusation of Stephen Gosson against poetry. The third one, it is nurse of abuse. Here Gosson would say that poetry after all speaks only about romance and about love and nothing else, and this can be misleading. It can mislead people and also scandalize people at times, and it does happen. To a large extent, you will have a lot of literature somehow or the other ending up either falling in love or talking about romance or such topics. For him, that can mislead people or scandalize people. Therefore, he says poetry is a nurse of abuse. And the last charge that he is not rather a charge, but something that he affirms. He says, as Plato had said, he did not want any poets in his republic, and therefore Stephen Gosson says, sort of reaffirming that particular stand of Plato and saying Plato had rightly banished poets from his republic, and it's a good thing that he had. So therefore, given a chance or an opportunity to Stephen Gosson, he also wouldn't want to have any poets in his probably place or his kingdom or his government. So what's the Sidney's definition of poetry? So that previous slide is to do with the charges laid down by Stephen Gosson against poets and poetry. So how does Sidney go about responding? So what's the Sidney's definition of poetry? So this is how he defines it: an art of imitation. So this an art of imitation means to fall back with all the previous thinkers. So he in that one line it means to say that he agrees with Plato and agrees with Aristotle that all art is nothing but imitation. That is to say representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically. So, in the second line, he would say, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting is to make something fake, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, meaning to say, reproduce something, to represent something, to produce something which is not original. And that's to directly agree actually with Plato, where he says the original copy of everything in the physical world exists in the world of forms. So, and what you get here is not original, but it's duplicate copies. And Sidney also sort of speaking on the same lines. A speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. And in the last line, he is talking of the purpose of literature. He says the purpose of literature is to teach and delight as well. So, after having looked at the definition of poetry according to Sidney, there are three things that we would find in this definition. What are the issues that Sidney talks of in the definition that we have just seen? The first one is the nature of imitation, and I have told you just now. I spoke about that the nature of definition falls in line with the thoughts of Plato and not with Aristotle, because Aristotle would say that imitation is original, and an artist is not an agent, but he is the creator. But here, imitation is counterfeiting. So, in the first part of the definition, we see the nature of imitation. In the second part of the definition, we see the problem of defining this nature. So, whether it is real, whether it is fake, whether it is representing, counterfeiting, original, not original, all that we see in the second part of the definition. And the third one is the injunction that poetry has the duty to teach some moral ends, or to meet some moral ends. So that is the final part of the definition, deals with the purpose of literature, or the purpose of poetry, just like any other writer has discussed before. So far in this video we have seen the background against which the defense of poetry, or an apology of poetry, was written by Sidney. It was nothing but Stephen Gosson's publication of The School of Abuse. We also saw the arguments of Stephen Gosson against theatre and poetry, and then we went on to see the definition of Sidney of poetry, and finally we saw the issues that he actually focuses on in that definition. So that will be the end of this video, and we'll continue to discuss Sidney in the next video, where we would see the counter arguments by Philip Sidney against the arguments of Stephen Gosson. So thank you for watching, and see you all in the next class.